His Excellency Mr. Wouter Plomp, the ambassador of the Netherlands. And I understand the Netherlands supports a lot of initiatives in Pakistan, but we're also curious to know, what are really best practices from the Netherlands around harassment cases and violence against women cases, and also the narratives around them that are, for example, in media or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Osama. And first of all, I'd like to say I'm inspired by the audience. There's obviously great attention for this very important subject. And I'm also inspired by the fact that there's a good mix of men and women, which I think is important, because this is very much about awareness. So it's definitely not only for women, but just as much for men. And I'm also inspired by the fact there's a good mix of age, some of the mature, to which I reckon myself as well, on the first bench, but also young people in the back, for whose future this whole subject is, of course, of vital importance. And maybe to start with, a bit of an uncomfortable truth is, first of all, this whole issue of gender-based violence, it's not limited to a part of the world or to a culture or to a society. It exists everywhere. And it exists just as much in my own country, in all European countries. In fact, there are some staggering statistics that really underline how important and how close to home this subject of gender-based violence is. And one of the most uncomfortable truths is that quite often, or actually in the majority of cases, the survivor knows the perpetrator, or the other way around. It's not an unknown, strange creature. No, it's very often someone that is known from the family, from the workplace, or even within a relationship. So this is very much about, and now I'm inspired by Christian, my British colleague, this is about having uncomfortable conversations. Because obviously this is an extremely uncomfortable conversation. And I admire the courage of Madam Ombudsman of setting up an office and creating the access to justice, which is vital. But I would like to point to another aspect which is, I think, is as vital as the access to justice, that is about prevention. Because indeed it takes an awful lot of courage to speak out on these issues. And wouldn't it be, every case that can be prevented, I think, is an enormous gain. And I think for prevention, we need awareness. And that's why we need the men and the boys as much as the women and the girls. I read just this afternoon a tweet by, I think, UN Women Pakistan, also about gender-based violence, and they had a hashtag running, men as allies. And I think that's actually very true, because it's very much about, I'm pointing at the first row, sorry, all men, it's about you and about me and about us. It's about men being aware of what gender-based violence is. Now coming to, you asked me, Osama, about best practices. Let me point to two best practices. One actually from maybe my own experience after managing an office for 30 years. And I can clearly see that as a manager how things have changed in my country, the Netherlands, over the past 30 years. Whereas I recognize the uncomfortableness of if someone speaks out about this, and indeed the tendency there often has been, and sometimes there still is, of blaming the victim, of saying, well, was it really so bad? What actually happened? I think we've now reached a stage, and I can say that confidently as a manager, where the definition of harassment is only with the victim/survivor. It is her, and sometimes him, that defines what to her or him is harassment, not to the perpetrator. The perpetrator will always say, I didn't mean it that way. That's not the point here, sorry. It's about how it's being perceived by the victim slash survivor. And I think that is an important gain. Second best practice is actually from the private sector. I visited a company in Sialkot, and there was a very clear commercial interest of the manager or owner of the company in keeping his workforce. And his workforce was mainly women. And obviously, to that company, harassment was an important phenomenon. And he said the only way to get rid of it was that whenever there was a complaint, he would believe, the manager was a he, I have to say, he would believe the complainant, the survivor slash victim. And in this case, there wasn't even a trial. He would simply say the fact that the victim was so courageous as to speak out, I believe her, and I say goodbye to the man, often the man, who did this. It may be not completely, let's say in terms of audi et alteram partem, sitting next to a judge, it's maybe another practice, but this was a practice from the private sector, and the manager assured me that he had a short period in which maybe some dubious cases were there, but after that, the number of complaints dropped sharply, and the women who worked at that company were retained in the workforce, and the manager was very satisfied with that.